In this video, you and I are going to take a plunge into the scratch building super detailing rabbit hole to produce the best Invader model ever. Then you can tell me how much I am wrong in this statement. Let's roll! Plenty of work to be done here in the cockpit, but as you will see a little bit later, it will all be worth the effort. Leaving the out-of-the-box center console as it is would put a massive hole in the space-time continuum, I'm afraid. So those had to be hacked off and replaced with pieces of leftover photo etch and some plastic discs. With a few exceptions, the rear end of the cockpit is virtually empty, which cannot be said about the prototype. So, our goal is to fill this empty space with details somewhat close in appearance to the reality of the situation. For the better part, I have no idea what the details represent. There is a fire extinguisher for all I know. But really, do I need to know all of this? I'm sure you'll tell me about it in the comments anyways. On the right side of the console, we have a nice looking lever. But it surely needs to be connected to something, right? I think a couple of hydraulic lines will do the job just fine. Then some wire looms to spice things up even further. And just as a heads up, there is going to be a lot of wire looming and plumbing throughout this build. Another thing you should probably know is that most of the tools and materials I use throughout this build will be listed in the description of this video. Those are affiliate links and will not add extra cost to you, but it will do a big dent in Mr. Bezos's wallet. So if you don't like the guy for some reason, be my guest and you're welcome. On the cockpit floor there is more detail than offered in the kit. So I again used some thin sheet of plastic to add these details, and also I did some riveting to enhance the look. And with a few more modifications, this area is ready, especially considering that we will have a seat over it. On the back bulkhead we have the rack for the radio stuff. Here I added only a few cables, along with some more details to spice up this map box or something that looks like it. And then I moved on to the actual bulkhead, where we have a whole host of pipes and cables and whatnot. So here I spent quite a lot of time researching and trying to find a way to represent those details in the best way possible without staying in this area forever. At the end it turned out well. It's a close representation, perhaps. Not that it's going to be very visible, but it was an experience and I think it will look good in any case. If you're interested, the silver wires that I'm using are actually soldering wire with different diameters. After a fairly unsuccessful attempt to sculpt a curtain, I started adding some details to the right hand side wall. Here it is interesting that in almost every reference image that I have seen, the setup is somewhat different, so I kinda mixed and matched something that looks interesting. This will be one of the more visible areas in the cockpit, so it is worth spending the extra time to make it at least a little bit more interesting. Again, adding some more twisted wires to represent wire looms and small details like knobs and buttons from stock plastic. At this point I'm already very eager to see how these things look, at least primed, if not painted, but we still have a long way to go. The kit cockpit seat needed some more details and also a set of masking tape and copper wire seat belts. And finally I was able to install the seat in place. For some more intricate wire loom work, I used stretched cotton bud tubes to imitate connectors that can be seen, and also these plastic tubes make the installation a little bit easier and cleaner. Another benefit is that they are easier to paint in a different color than the pipe or the cables, so this will be another tiny bit of detail that can pop up. As you might have noticed, I use pre-drilled holes to make the installation of these details, at least the larger hoses and pipes, a little bit easier. In the wing root area on the inside of the fuselage we have those holes, so first I had to deal with them. I used some thicker plastic and then I had to add the rib details that are missing. Probably a better job could have been done, but it's not going to be a very visible area, so let's move forward. After adding what I believe are the control cables, I went on to add some wire looms, just the same twisted wire tow cable looking wire looms, and then I added some straps on them from masking tape so that they can look a little bit more interesting. On the bomb bay side of the rear cockpit bulkhead, I had to hide some holes again using sheet plastic. And since this is going to be a rather nicely visible area from the bomb bay doors, I added a lot of piping, at least those that I could figure out the routing of. Also I added some small cylinders that should represent the connections between the pipes. Not that I'll allow anyone to flip my model upside down, but still we'll have the images and this footage to prove that there is something inside. And rather quickly here I want to thank ICM for providing this sample kit. The middle bulkhead also needed some work, mainly removing some plastic that should not be there, and then adding some sort of pipes running across probably fuel lines. And also here in this area are what I believe the actuators for the bomb bay doors. So I made something to look like an electrical motor with the appropriate cables and relays, perhaps, who knows. Again, this is an approximation of the real thing. There is so much I can judge looking at pictures that are not shot in a favorable angle or anything, so this is as much as we can do. Again, copper wire, twisting, bending, gluing, adding some straps, and we can call it a day on this one after this rod gets inserted in place. The kit detail provided for the gunner's compartment is not bad at all, but still we can do a lot of improvements. So after gluing the parts in and the rear bulkhead to one side of the fuselage, I started adding the familiar twisted wire looms, and then I did a continuation of the control cables from the bomb bay to this area. Using sheet aluminum, I created those channels to further improve the impression that the control cables go through the bulkheads. On the rear bulkhead, among other things, I added a scratch-built oxygen hose, which is going to continue on the right fuselage half. I don't know what most of these things that I am placing are, but still, since they are on the reference images, it's good to have them here too. If you like how things are going so far, leave this video a little bit of thumbs up so it can reach more people. To improve the visibility towards this area, I removed a molded in hatch in the forward bulkhead, and this should give us, if not more visibility, then a little bit more light so we can have a good look from the upper windows. And with that, I think the gunner's compartment is sufficiently detailed. Alright, it is time to start the painting process with some Mr. Surfacer 1500 black primer. This will be a perfect foundation for shadows later on, and also will give a nice adhesion with the paint. The next layer will be Tamiya's LP11 silver to facilitate the chipping that we'll do later on. And after a layer of hairspray, I applied some more black paint to unify the surface. And then I went ahead to apply the base color, which is interior green. I did it in ununiform mottled fashion so we can get some variation of the color, and the painted areas this way don't look like a blob of green paint. Next up, using a brush and some black paint, I went ahead to paint the instrument panels and the control panels. I had to be pretty careful here because having the black paint on the green would not be ideal. To get the paint to behave better, I used drying retarder and I diluted it quite a bit, which meant that I had to lay down a few layers. Along with the instrument panels, I did paint the wire looms in black to serve as a shadow layer. After that was done, I went ahead to do a dry brushing using a oil paint. In this case, for this color, I chose a buff oil paint. I think this color complements the green, makes it a little bit faded and worn down looking, which is always a good thing when you do a model. On top of that, the edges get highlighted, which in turn adds a little bit more definition. With the dry brushing out of the way, I went ahead to do the chipping, which in fact did not turn out as good as I wanted it to. Partly, I think, because I used a very strong hairspray and this makes it harder to remove, but also maybe the oil paint dry brushing prevented the water to get through all of the layers. After some more specific chipping using a silver watercolor pencil, I went back to dry brushing with neutral gray oil paint on the control panels. The neutral gray is a better choice for my taste because the buff would be a little bit too strong. To pick out the various knobs, switches and levers, I mixed a medium gray acrylic paint, and with a fine brush I picked out all of those knobs and buttons. Also, I painted all the levers. On some places, like the levers and some of the engine controls will have a different color, like the red, but the light gray is a good base, much better than if they were black. Painting those small details is a nerve-wracking job, having the potential to ruin everything around, so I was barely touching the surface with the brush, more like I was touching the paint on the brush to the surface only, and needless to say the paint amount was very small. The instrument panel on this kit was exemplary for an injection molded kit, and the fact that it is mostly black was an advantage. I painted the top part in very dark gray color, got in some dry brushing, some panel line wash, used the kit's decals, which are fortunately single pieces, and did some detail painting with silver, with red, with transparent orange. And for the instrument faces I used yellow tint clear coat. Some color will not hurt anybody, so here we have a bit of weathered down leather. And then some yellowish color for the wire looms. This is the color, or at least this looks like the color I can see on the reference images. Carefully applied on the top of the wire looms so we can still have the black as a shadow underneath. Here I'm using water-based acrylics mixed with some drying retarder, so the paint does not dry on the tip of the brush, much more convenient this way. And then a little bit of silver paint on the straps to imitate the clamps. For some more detailed look, I added a few stencils here and there from leftover decal sheets, and I think the stencils do a rather good job. To add some surface dust accumulations, I used Tamiya buff paint, very highly diluted, and applied it with the airbrush, trying to simulate how it would generate and accumulate over time in the nooks and crannies under the gravity force, and of course moved around by the feet and other body parts of the crew. The next weathering step will be to apply a weathering wash. This one that I am using is dark green, which is good as a complement color for the light green cockpit. Unfortunately, mine was a little bit out of its expiration date, I guess, and was very clumpy inside the bottle. But in any case, with a lot of shaking and stirring, I was able to use it. This, as you know, gives a lot of definition to the details and in general some more dirty appearance. For the wire looms, I used a gray wash, and then using combination of Q-tips and brushes moistened with some mineral spirits, I removed the excess wash away. The next area that needed some attention were the gear bays. This kit is designed so that the gear bay doors attach together with some of the internal structure of the gear base, which is on one hand good because the assembly is quite sturdy, but on the other hand it is always in your way. So I started by adding more of the structural components inside the gear base, trying to be as close to the real thing as possible. For this I use plastic from food packaging and other packages. The contour gauge is a very useful tool for anyone that wants to do any kind of scratch building. It allows me to trace the shapes and then create a detail that closely matches any curvature or shape that you might want to replicate. Since the gear base of this airplane are shared with the engine gondolas, this means that part of the lower wing is the ceiling of the gear bay. I think that any such detailing would have not been possible if these were assembled, so I had to make quite a lot of dry fitting tests to see if the additional details I'm adding are not interfering in any way with the assembly of these pieces. Also, on the bulkhead I had to include a few holes that would have to correspond to cables or brake lines that come from the gear legs. So this came into play as one thing that needed to be taken into consideration. I applied some Mr. Metal primer on the exposed copper parts and then went to apply the usual Mr. Surfacer 1500 black. Then I did some Tamiya LP11 silver, and this time instead of hairspray I opted to go for a sponge chipping. This was followed by the interior color, which is interior green, applied in relatively thin layers. Here I'm trying not to obliterate all the shadows given by the black surface primer. After the base coat was dry, I applied some superficial paint distress using a lighter shade of the base color and a sponge. And then I move on to apply some dry brushing with oil paint, buff color oil paint in this case, on all of the edges and raised portions of the details, and inevitably some of the dry brushing goes on the flat surfaces as well, giving them a little bit more faded and worn look. After I was done with this, I went ahead to remove the masking fluid, which revealed a nice chipping underneath. And now it is time to apply the weathering wash. This time I made the weathering wash using Starship Field oil paint, highly diluted with mineral spirits. My observations are that the oil paint wash flows much better than the factory made washes. After the wash had some time to dry, I removed the excess using different types of Q-tips and a brush. Then, as before, I went ahead to cover the wire looms with black paint for the shadow layer. Some of the pipes here will remain in the green color, but the clamps and the straps and the connectors still had to be painted. Just like in the internal side of the fuselage, I painted the wire looms yellow. And again, a coat of dusting with the airbrush and a highly diluted buff paint from Tamiya. The basic structure of the gear legs is very well done out of the box, but still need to add some details, mainly stuff like brackets and brake pipes, etc. In general, quite a good out of the box detail considering how complex this gear assembly is. After adding a bracket, I started adding small tubes, and those made the routing of the brake pipes very easy because the only thing I had to do is thread the stretch sprue through these microtubes and glue it in place. To create the shiny surface of the shock absorber rod, I used a self-adhesive aluminum foil, and now it looks like polished metal. Then I drilled some holes to accommodate the ends of the copper wire that I'm going to use further up the gear leg. All of that is super glued with my super special CA glue applicator. Copper wire is very useful here because it is quite soft and malleable, and it allows to create very realistic bends. To simulate the clamps, I used very thin strips of aluminum foil, which is self-adhesive, but still I used some CA glue on it to strengthen the bond. Then I scratch built a brace of some sorts using stock plastic and a small diameter metal rod. I squished the ends so it can fit in the slits in the plastic, and it looks very convincing. Then I continued to add different hoses that presumably transfer the hydraulic pressure from inside the wings and the fuselage towards the brakes and the actuation of the gear legs themselves. And for those I used fishing line, which is very sturdy, and this will have to be attached to the gear bay, so I'll leave them like this for now. The nose gear leg is a much simpler deal than the main gear legs. Probably there is no brakes on the nose wheel, or the lines are inside of the actual tubing. With the detailing done, it is time to start the painting, first with a layer of black primer on the gear legs as well as the resin wheels from Edward. For the tires, I used Tamiya's LP65 rubber black, which in my opinion is excellent color for the job. And also I might add that the resin wheels are an excellent addition. Edward also provides a set of masks in the resin wheels kit, so I masked off the tires and applied silver on the rims. The rim of the nose wheel is a separate part, which made it easier to paint. My reference images suggest that the gear legs are painted in silver, so the silver goes there too. Here I'm using Tamiya's LP11 silver, which is a very good color and also it is quite sturdy. With the airbrushing done, I switched on to paint the hoses using acrylic paint with some drying retarder so that the paint won't dry on the tip of the brush so fast. To start the weathering, I used dark gray panel line accent color from Tamiya. This is a very good product in my opinion because the gray does not have that strong contrast of the black, and also it dries with a very nice smooth gradient, and if you want to enhance the strength you can always apply one more layer. Now, weathering the rubber part of the wheels is a little bit of a more complicated story because we have to take into account the conditions in which this airplane that you are modeling has been landing on and where it has lived in this moment of time when you are representing it. So in my case, this aircraft has been on tarmac runway and it does not make sense to make the tires all muddy and grimy, so I went ahead to apply buff oil paint with dry brushing on the threads of the tire, and then where the tire meets the rim, for a little bit more saturated dirt appearance, I used Tamiya's brown panel line accent color on the lower part of the gear legs and also right on the inner side of the rim and around the rim lip. Using Starship Base Lodge oil paint, I did some grime around the struts, faded it towards the ends with a brush and then clean up the excess using a Q-tip. After that was done, the only thing left to do was to assemble the front rim and tire to complete the wheel, and there we have our gear legs assembly all done. The engines of this kit are really nicely done, so in terms of extra details there will not be very much to do here. After the assembly is done, I'm going to start painting with a layer of dark aluminum. Then I left the paint to cure for a while and I applied some panel line accent color from Tamiya, in this case dark gray. Black will also work. After assembling the details that sit on the crankcase, I removed a little bit of the details that are molded in to replace them with microtubes that will eventually contain the ignition wires. I have a dedicated tutorial on how to make these microtubes, so if you are interested I will leave a link down in the description. It was quite a lot of work to install all of these, but they look very cool in my opinion. To spice things up a little bit, I added a crude representation of bolt heads on the distributor caps, where I drilled a few holes and then filled them with stretch sprue. After gluing this down on the case, I added a few wires that I can see on the reference images. With that done, it is time to do some more painting. I mixed and airbrushed a bluish grey color onto the crankcase. The ignition ring I hand painted with a brush in black, and then I painted the tips with a silver paint. a lightened version of the base color is what I use to pick out the bolt details. This is a nice way to make them more visible. And then another round of panel line accent color, dark gray in this case. More of the weathering to come with some Starship Field oil paint, a few dots here and there, and then blend them with the brush. The assembly of the engine is very easy. Everything is made so that it fits well together, and with a little bit of care to match all the assembly aids provided, it is a breeze all in all. Here I used entirely liquid cements until I got to the point to install the ignition cables. For them I used CA glue, locking them in one of their positions, doing some bending and then cutting to length to glue them to their other end position. For the ignition cables I used copper wire with appropriate diameter. I intentionally left those unpainted because this color is something that can be seen on reference images. Also, using soldering wire, I did a few pipes that run from end to the crankcase. The cradle of the engine is also provided in the kit, which will come handy when installing it in the cowling. On to the exhaust stacks, I drilled them out, which is not bad on its own, but when you get a lot of those it starts to get boring. Anyhow, I moved on to spray a layer of flat brown paint, and then I did some Tamiya smoke on the tips, and finally I covered all with a flat varnish. And that's my humble take on heat corrosion. A very thoughtful part of this kit is the jig for the exhaust stacks assembly. I'm not sure if this is doable without this, but it works great. So building all those stacks in their right place is a easy job. The final part of this engine assembly segment are the propellers. After a coat of black primer, I applied Tamiya LP11 silver, and after that cured, I applied liquid mask on the leading edges of the blades with a sponge. The cap on the front of the propeller I painted with polished aluminum, and after I got that mask off, I applied a few layers of black paint. When this was dry, I removed the liquid mask to reveal a very nice chipping effect. Out of the box we have a couple of decals for each blade, so I laid those down. The decals are quite good actually, very thin, and after those were done I applied a layer of varnish to protect them. After some careful masking, the tips of the propellers got some yellow paint and the hub was painted with matte aluminum. For the weathering I started with a dark grey wash on the hub and then some pencil chipping on the blades. I also did some sponge chipping with dark grey paint on the tips of the blades where the yellow is, and also I did a little bit of oil staining where the hub meets the polished aluminum cup. Now let's deal with the armament, first starting off with the bumps. After assembly I decided to remove the fins because they were too thick, and for their replacement I used a photo etch set from Edwards F6F Hellcat, which is not going to carry any bumps, so I installed all the details that come with this kit, and now the bump looks way better than before. After a layer of black primer, I did a speckling with the airbrush, and then I started adding very light coats of olive drop. Then I soaked the surface with mineral spirits and blended down some buff oil paint. In the corners I used a wash made out of Starship base sludge oil paint and then blended it in with the brush. And finally I touched up all the raised details with a dry brush with the buff oil paint. With that done, I installed the bomb racks in place and then glued on the bombs. The fit was not something perfect, but still they held up together. The out-of-the-box napalm tanks were not the correct ones, so I did some digging, designed and printed a set myself. I also did a replacement turret barrels which fit directly in the place of the old ones. I will leave a link in the description so you can get those files if you want to have these details. Having the ability to design and produce my own parts is a game changer in my opinion. Really love the technology and can only highly recommend this to anyone bitten by the scratch building bug to give it a try. Truly opens another dimension of possibilities. After a coat of primer, I applied a layer of Tamiya's LP11 silver on the tanks and their pylons. That was followed by a layer of hairspray on the tanks and some masking fluid applied with sponge for the pylons. Then I painted the pylons with a very bright orange and the tanks with some yellow, just as on my reference images. Then to do the chipping on the pylons I simply removed the masking fluid, and on the tanks I did some deliberate scrubbing with a brush and some water. To maximize the effect of the details, I applied a dark grey Panaline accent color from Tamiya. Honestly, this color works on pretty much everything. To facilitate the next weathering step, I applied some flat varnish and left it to cure for a few hours. Next up come the oils, first off with some buff. I applied white spirit on the entire surface and then put some buff dots down. I stippled those to create somewhat even but textured coverage, and then using a larger flat brush I created a streaky looking surface. I left this layer to cure overnight and came back with some Starship filth. This I applied on the surface using a toothpick, thus creating very fine dots. Just like with the buff, I blended those using stippling, but here the effect was not as uniform because of the size and the spacing of the dots. To fortify the spilling stain, I used Starship base sludge which I blended, and then some shaft and bearing grease which was more like painted, be it with a toothpick. On the silver painted turrets we are going to have some weathering as well. I imagine that weathering to happen on those areas which are near to the mechanisms where we can find grease and oils. Once again, Starship filth will be blended from the base of the turret fading towards the top and from the vertical moving section fading away from the joints. And with the installation of the homemade barrels, the outer part of the turret is done. For the top turret we have the internal part provided in the kit, so I assembled that and drilled the holes for more authenticity. After this was painted, I glued it in place and installed the control cable. This was brush painted in yellow with some darker stripes for a kick, and with that this segment is complete. We are going to deal with some more armament later on, but let's move on and finally assemble the whole model. First we have a couple of small transparent parts on each fuselage half. For the window on the gunner's compartment, first I'm going to paint the edges of the part with black marker. Somehow the black edges create the impression of much thinner part than it actually is. Now let's move on to the bulkheads and their integration into the fuselage. Using Mr. Cement Deluxe I cover both surfaces. After the bulkhead is in position, I will install the other fuselage half so I can get the best alignment possible. Just have to make sure not to accidentally glue the second fuselage half in. And this will be the template for each and every one of the details from the interior of the model. I am actually quite surprised how well all of this fits together, given all the additional details we added so far. To be fair, I expected issues despite all the dry fit tests that I did. Now let's get the cockpit section ready for installation. First comes the pilot's seat, which fits nicely. Then the yoke meets the control column, and then they both get glued on the cockpit floor. The instrument panel needs to be maneuvered around the wire loom, but eventually it will take its place into this composition. And now we can proceed towards the installation of the cockpit on the left fuselage half. Here I had to be very cautious about all the pipework on the bulkhead and not damage it. Now let's glue the fuselage sides together. Tape them for good measure and let them sit aside. The nose assembly will have to start with some parting lines cleanup. If those are gonna be called blast tubes, they better look like tubes and not like rods. On such a small diameter, it is frustratingly hard and just as important to do a true center punch, or at least as close as possible. For the drilling, I will start with a small pilot hole and will enlarge the opening later on. The nose is an assembly of 4 parts, and unfortunately the engineering here is not great. Just the way that the nose section is split ensures subpar fit. I am aware that ICM did this to allow themselves to reuse much of the parts from one variant to the other, but from builder's perspective it would have been much better to have a different approach. The next thing to do is to insert and glue in our blast tube stacks, and this step is fairly easy and the fit is not bad either. Since the main gear legs are very far forward on this aircraft, we will need quite a lot of weight in the front. And because all of the weight, I added a lot of additional support structure so that the joint between the nose and the fuselage can be strong enough to carry it. We will have to figure out the best approach on filling the gaps later on, but for now let's move on and add some other pieces of the puzzle. Like the panel where the lower turret lives. Small steps on the cockpit side and the left side will need to be filled, sanded or otherwise taken care of later on. Same goes for the top panel, but due to its size and prominent position it will be much more labor intensive. When it comes to the wings assembly, we have another strange and not welcome decision. The shell ejection ports are molded shut and they have to be opened up. And talking about the wings assembly, here things start to look much better, as the actual fit is rather good. Working on small sections at a time, starting from the wing root area, I made my way around the entire wing without a single issue. All panel lines are nicely aligned and there is no significant step on the seam. The flap system is made out of 2 parts for each wing, one on each side of the engine nacelle. The kit offers those split in upper and lower half. In this case this is not an issue as the parts fit flawlessly. The installation of the control surfaces on the wing is also a pleasant surprise. The ailerons fit snugly in the location ports and the alignment is perfect. The flaps assembly is awkward to begin with, but once they snap in place it all starts to make sense. The fit feels tight, secure and precise. The rudder is split in half as well, so with the help of some Mr. Cement Deluxe they get easily glued together. The horizontal stabilizers come into 2 pieces for the main fixed plane and a 3rd piece for the actual control surface. After gluing the fixed plane together, we can slide the elevators over the attachment points. Assembling the gear base also requires some attention, mainly because of the additional details. At this point I only glued the rear portion. The front I left free because later I used the wing as a jig to glue the forward part of the gear bay nacelle combo. When gluing the front end of the nacelle, I was paying attention to the joint to avoid unnecessary steps. After I glued the intake on the nacelle, I started messing around with the surface textures. deepening the panel lines and adding rivet details along them. The fit between the nacelle and the wing is pretty solid. There are some pretty minor gaps, but not so much to be a concern. To fix the problematic joints on the fuselage, I used all filler solutions in my arsenal, including plastic glue as the main filler. I have covered this step in great detail in the series, so I am not going to bore you with this right now. Instead, let's continue with the assembly. First order of business is to insert the aiming station into the gunner's compartment and fix it in place with the canopy. I am not going to glue the gunner station just yet. The fit of both canopies is good, partially due to the kit itself, but in some areas due to the work we did earlier. However, when I apply the primer, I may be proven wrong. We'll see. The spars coming from the bulkheads are here to provide a good fit and support for the massive wings of this aircraft. This is a very welcome solution, as relying on a simple butt joint would not be a very good idea. The horizontal stabilizers have somewhat more simple joint, but they are much smaller, so this is kinda okay. And with the airplane in one piece, we can go on to the next stage. As a good boy, I'm starting with a layer of primer. Mr. Surfacer 1500 Grey is what I chose for this build. Next up, I covered the entire aircraft with Tamiya's LP11 Silver. This will be a good base for the paint effects, but also will allow me to do some bare metal chipping. After the silver paint was dry, I applied hairspray over a big portion of the wings and some other places where I want to do hairspray chipping. I will also do some more targeted paint distress. This will be done using masking fluid applied with a sponge. The technique allows for a random application of stone chip-like paint damage. Also, I am going to apply some masking fluid with a brush, so I can better replicate the wear and tear visible on reference images. Before anything else, I will paint the wingtips and the top of the tail. For a base color, I chose Insignia White. After the base color, I applied some brown marbling. I think this color will work well with the Insignia Red. And the Insignia Red will indeed be the final color of those details. The paint was applied in several light layers for better opacity control. For the camouflage surfaces, I wanted to do some panel marbling with different color in each panel, or rather group of panels. The lower surfaces are going to be in bluish gray, so I did the marbling in navy blue, flat earth and one of the greens. Don't remember which one, but it is probably in the description. To further enhance this patchwork of colorful panels, I painted over sections and junctions of panel lines. All in all, a big mess. Needless to say, this exercise took quite a lot of time, and it was literally painful at times. So if you decide to do something similar, my advice would be to start with something small. Anyhow, it is time to blend everything with countless light layers of Tamiya's XF53 neutral gray. It is a good practice to leave each layer to cure for some time, so it can reach its opacity. This way you'll know much better which will be the last layer. Before this last layer, I decided to add more effects with Insignia White paint. I airbrushed some streaking at the leading edges, highlighted some panel lines, and painted over some non-existent rivet rows. After a few more layers, the lower camo color was complete, for now. If you are into this sort of detailed builds, I am sure you will like what I have to offer in my YouTube membership. For tiers Advanced and Master, I post daily updates with images on the progress of my current builds. For the Apprentice tier, I offer early access to my videos among other things. Most importantly, you will help fund this channel's existence. Check the join button under the video and see the details. The upper section of the fuselage was divided in two general areas. Somewhat freshly filled applied olive drop paint on the nose, nacelles and rudder being one, and I know those are technically 4 areas, but you get the point. And the second area, which is the remainder of the aircraft, will have heavily faded olive drop paint. So the fresh olive drop areas got marbling with more vibrant and saturated colors. For the fresh olive drop, I chose Tamiya's XF62 olive drop. Shocker, I know. First, I applied the demarcation lines freehand. I will be very surprised to learn that ground crew in a war zone uses masking when applying paint, so it's gonna be a bit rough around the edges. Then it is a matter of applying the usual thin layers of the base paint until just enough of the marbling is visible. And that will mean different things for different people, so I cannot tell you how many layers that is. For the rest of the airframe, I use more subdued, earthly tones, because otherwise the marbling will overpower the base faded olive drop, and in turn make me apply more coats, which can lead to totally obscuring the marbling. Besides, this palette seems more suitable for the faded olive drop. Speaking of which, this color I mixed by combining the base XF62 with a considerable amount of XF57 buff. What is the ratio? I don't know, because my eyeballs might be calibrated but they are not graduated. Just like I did on the underside, after the first few layers I highlighted a bunch of panel lines, hatches and even sections of the larger panels. And of course the leading edges got the stripes. That was all done with straight XF57 buff. Breaking up the large surface on the wings is essential in my opinion, so taking this extra step is quite important. Then a few more blending layers with the faded drop mixture have to go on, but here it is a bit trickier. Now we have to be careful not only to adequately blend the marbling, but also the highlights. That's why the latter should be done with a suitable color, and moreover not to be overly saturated. In any case, I am very happy with how the camouflage turned out. Let me know what you think about it. On to the next step. Most of the markings on the airplane are going to be airbrushed using masks. This may seem as a tedious task compared to applying decals, and it is, but it looks far better and allows us to use the same painting techniques as we did with the camouflage. For the national insignias, I am going to use insignia white from Tamiya and insignia red and blue from MRP, all being lacquer based paints. As it is the lightest color of them all, first I am going to apply the insignia white. First with some marbling inside the panels for more uneven and non-uniform feel, and then a few light blend coats to build up the opacity. When the white paint is dry, I can put the next mask in position and paint the red stripes on the insignia along with a few service stencils, like the walkways on top of the wings and the propeller line on the front end of the airplane. For a bit of a faded appearance, I am going to dress up the insignia red with a highly diluted buff paint, and then put back the masks over the red, after giving the paint some time to dry of course. Next comes the insignia blue. Here I decided to do a panel line pre-shading instead of the marbling I was doing so far. No particular reason for that, just felt that way. To get the variation provided by the marbling, I applied the blending coats in more motley and cloudy style. And considering the small area that needs to be covered, I think this is pretty good. To fade the insignia blue again, I used highly diluted buff color. This was applied inside the panels and quite carefully, so it does not become too aggressive of an effect. Now enjoy some masks removal. For the letters on top of the wings and some stencils on the tail of the airplane, we need some yellow paint. Since here we don't have much space to mess around with panel lines and marbling and whatnot, I'm going to apply the color, and as I go I will bump the opacity on the features I encounter. The color I use here is RLM04 from Mr. Hobby, mixed with some flat varnish to match the sheen of the camo. Keeping it close to the plot line, I'm going to do the buff therapy over the yellows, and this will not only give the color a little bit more faded look, but also will warm it up a little bit, because this yellow is a little bit cold for my taste. And then on a few selected spots I added some insignia white to the buff to kick the contrast up a notch. So what do you think? Is it worth the time and effort spent painting the markings, or you would prefer to use the good old decals? Comment down below the video. Of course, we are going to have some decals involved, mainly the nose art, but also a couple of service stencils. These nose art decals have practically no carrier film around it, so it will go directly onto the matte surface of the camo paint. There are a few obstacles that the decal have to conform to, but in general nothing that the Agama Strong decal solution cannot deal with. I did tear down a small piece, but I repaired that with a careful brush painting. For the service stencils, I applied gloss varnish on the landing area, and I can already hear a few people screaming it's not necessary. But there you go, that's how I do it when there is carrier film involved. Moving on to the next chapter. Okay, the first weathering thing that we need to do is to peel off the liquid mask and reveal the nice chipping that's going to appear. Silicone brushes are very helpful here because the liquid mask sticks to them, and this way we can remove more stubborn pieces right away. Now let's reactivate the hairspray and continue with the chipping. On many of my reference images I could see crew walking on the top surfaces of the airplane, so I was thinking that it is probably quite nicely weathered up there, and then I found some images on the internet which allowed me to see how the top looks on a aircraft which is restored to a flying condition, but regardless it was quite heavily weathered, and the pattern shows that the weathering of this aircraft is very heavy indeed on the top surfaces. So here I'll go rather heavy, then the rest of the weathering will tone this down a little bit, so I don't think we have anything to worry about. Interestingly enough, on the pictures I have seen of this flight restored aircraft, it appears that the gondolas were also repainted at some point and then they got scratched up once again. So for me this means that this is a very heavy traffic area, and probably because of the heat of the engines the paint doesn't hold up very well. Now let's make ourselves a nice spin wash using some Starship Base Lodge oil paint and some white spirit. I'm going to apply this spin wash directly onto the flat surface, and this wash being fairly highly diluted, it should not have a very serious effect, which is the goal. I really want the panel lines to be, of course, highlighted, but very subtly. My experience so far shows that on some places we might need some going over the same area twice to achieve a better opacity of this wash, but that's okay because having control over the process is a good thing. On the neutral gray belly of the aircraft, I'm going to use Starship Field again as a pin wash. This Starship Field color is a little bit lighter and also a little bit cooler, so in my opinion it is better suited for such a light color as the neutral gray. The removal of the cured wash is a simple matter of swiping it down the airflow with a flat brush slightly damped in white spirit. It is not a bad idea to clean the brush every now and then. Before I continue any further, I will apply a coat of flat clear varnish over the decals to facilitate the weathering and to blend them in with the rest of the surfaces. I added a very tiny amount of buff into the flat clear, and with this I'm going to add some fading on the more horizontal surface of the decal. The next step will be some additive chipping using a silver pencil, which is my preferred method for some smaller areas where greater control is needed. You can see that without any talent whatsoever, our chipping looks rather nicely. Just the silver on its own would look rather overwhelming in my opinion, so I'm going to continue using a sand colored pencil. So with this I'm going to try and simulate some superficial paint distress which can and will occur where the paint did not get entirely damaged and removed to reveal and expose the metal underneath, but rather was nicked and thus a different color occurred. The thing with these pencils, if you're not familiar with them, is that you need a matte surface for them to work properly, because in other cases the pigment just don't have anywhere to go. Okay, now let's start messing around with some oils. I'm going to start by applying some Starship Field here and there, mainly on the control surfaces to do some streaking, blending in where necessary, where the streaks are too obvious, too heavy, and continuing forward, doing the same in some multiple areas. Next up, I would like to add some more earthy tones on top of the airplane where the crew walk up and down, and I would imagine that their boots were not particularly clean. For that I'm going to use Abteilung 093 Earth. For the bottom of the nacelles, where most of the grime from the engines is supposedly going to end up, I'm going to apply a few layers of oil paints, and first I'm going to start with some Starship Field, which I'm going to gradually blend from each panel line towards the back. Just like on the top of the wing, I'm going to add some dirt streaks in a few special areas which are prone to exhibit such kind of effect, again with some Starship Field. Another place where I will facilitate the black watercolor pencil is the underside of the wings, and here I will try and add some small streaks which are coming from the dust and dirt accumulated in the panel lines and various crevices. The final weathering layer for this underside of the nacelle is a layer of Starship base sludge, which will be very randomly dispersed all over the place, and I'm doing this over a surface that has been pre-wet with some mineral spirits. This will facilitate the blending, and this will be a little bit of work on the panels which are covered with fresh olive drop, mainly around the nose area and the cockpit. And the reason that I want to do this kind of job is because these panels look quite uniform, especially on the sides, and I would like them to be a little bit more interesting. Now that I have spread the oil paint with dry brush, I will use a little bit of mineral spirits on the brush to help me blend the oil a little bit more, and of course to reduce the saturation. Using a watercolor pencil called Sepia, I will add a little bit more saturated brown color on the panel line that marks the wing root to account for probably a little bit more denser dirt accumulation. Nothing very harsh or too obvious to make things a little bit more saturated. Now let's deal with the exhaust stains. So the first step of this process will be to apply some layers of heavily diluted flat black paint. Initially behind the panel lines which are perpendicular to the airflow. The disturbances of this airflow will lead to higher soot accumulation in the area. Also, the panel lines which are parallel to the said flow will get some attention. After the panel line work is done, I will start applying the pattern of the exhaust gases. This is going to be airplane specific as the route that the gases take depends on the aerodynamics of the aircraft and the placement of the stacks. So, as I have said earlier, reference images are necessary. This base soot layer can be broader as this is supposed to be the oldest soot accumulation and it had its time to spread as much as it could. Next up comes a layer of hairspray or a dedicated chipping fluid should you wish to go this route. This far we were applying only rich mixture residue, hence the black color. Now let's put on the lean mixture residue. For this I used a concoction of Tamiya Insignia White and buff colors at no particular mixing ratio. This layer I am going to try and place inside the black residue stains. I don't think it is a big issue if you get out of those boundaries, but still a better effect can be achieved if we do not obliterate the previous layer entirely. Here the paint is also very well diluted, so we can stack up several layers and in this way tune in the opacity of the effect. A few perpendicular streaks can break up the streamlined effect a bit. After all, exhaust gases come out in pulses. After the paint had some time to cure, we can reactivate the hairspray with small amounts of water and remove the lean mixture residue from carefully selected locations. Generally speaking, this is on heavy traffic areas, around access panels, or where it is suggested by your reference images. Sometimes such effects can be had on places that does not make a lot of sense, but we cannot really understand the dynamics of ground crew maintaining and servicing an aircraft, so reference pictures are a good asset. Before the final step of the exhaust stains, we can add some oil leaks and stains to fortify the notion that all the grime was accumulated over some period of time, and then a final layer of darker exhaust soot, much tighter than the first one, ideally within the boundaries of the white lean mixture residue. Think of it as the residue accumulated most recently, the previous flight for example. The assembly will start with attaching the engines where they belong. The next thing to do is to put the engine cowlings in place. The fit is rather good, but still we'll need to make sure that the tops and the back of the cowlings are flush. Now let's put the cowl flaps on. One advice I have here is don't remove these from the sprues until you're ready to glue and then remove them one by one because each of them is going to a specific location, so it probably will not fit unless placed on its target location. The one part of this assembly I was definitely not looking forward was the main gear legs installation, only because of the extra details I put on them. Of course, the gear legs themselves fit nicely in place, exactly as intended by the OM. but fishing in the hydraulic lines was quite the experience. The front gear leg, on the other hand, is as easy to install as it gets. My only concern is how long it will survive under all that weight in the nose. The resin weighted wheels from Edward are a gem and lift the model to another level, as the wheels on this airplane are very prominent. Next up, let's put the bomb bay doors in place. The fit here is, I would say, adequate. It could have been a bit more sure-footed, but this works too. The turrets are super simple to install on the airplane. A small amount of slow setting cement on the fuselage and then the turret goes on top. Among other bits and bobs, I installed my homemade napalm tanks. I am actually very proud of myself. They fit. And if you think this is not something to be proud of, well, tell me why so many kit-making companies failed so miserably. One very hardly visible but also cool detail in my eyes is the antenna running from the mast behind the canopy to the tail. The more regular viewers may have noticed that I am not posting as often or as regularly as before. Since this I think will be the case for the foreseeable future, I strongly recommend to join my email notifications list and receive a word from me every time I upload a new video. Link you can find in the description. Thanks to all my Patreons and YouTube members for supporting the channel and my efforts. Thank you all for watching this so far, and until next time, happy modeling fellas! Oh, and don't forget to tell me how this is not the best B-26.